In the summer of 1942, a 61-year-old general stood in the mountains of occupied Yugoslavia and looked out over a landscape that was about to become one of the most brutal killing fields of the entire Second World War. And this man was not young. He was not inexperienced. He was not acting under duress. He had spent 40 years building a military career across 2 empires and 2 world wars. He had commanded troops in combat on multiple fronts. He had risen to the rank of general in not 1, but 2 different national armies. And now he was here, in the mountains of the Balkans, with the full backing of Heinrich Himmler and the SS behind him. He was about to build something that would become one of the most criminal military formations in the history of modern warfare. And his name was Arthur Phleps. If you have never heard that name before, then by the end of this story, you will understand exactly why you should have, and why the people of Yugoslavia never forgot it. The story of Arthur Phleps does not begin in Germany. It does not begin in the SS. It does not begin with Adolf Hitler. It begins in a small town called Bertholm in Transylvania in 1881, which at that time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and is today part of Romania. Phleps was born into the ethnic German community that had lived in that part of southeastern Europe for centuries. A community that called itself the Transylvanian Saxons and that had maintained its German language and culture and identity across generations of living surrounded by Romanians and Hungarians and Slavs. And this background is not some minor biographical detail. It is the key to understanding everything Phleps became. Because growing up as a member of an ethnic minority in a multi-ethnic empire does something to a person's sense of identity. It makes ethnicity feel like the most fundamental thing about you, more fundamental than nationality or citizenship or the borders that politicians draw on maps. And that feeling, this idea of ethnic identity as the core of who you are, was exactly the ideological foundation on which Heinrich Himmler was building his vision of the SS. The young Arthur Phleps showed early promise as a student and as an athlete and as a natural leader. He chose a military career in the Austro-Hungarian army, which was the natural choice for an ambitious young man from a good family in the empire. He proved himself a capable and determined officer, and he advanced steadily through the ranks in the years before the First World War. Then the war came in 1914, and it tested Phleps in the way war tests every soldier. He came through it with distinction, serving in various command and staff positions, accumulating combat experience across multiple fronts, and earning the kind of reputation for toughness and competence that stays with a military officer for the rest of his career. By the time the war ended in 1918, Phleps was a proven combat commander with real experience and real ability. And the fact that his side had lost the war did nothing to diminish the professional skills he had developed during it. What happened next in Phleps's life was one of the most revealing choices of his entire career. Because when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed and the map of Europe was redrawn, ethnic Germans like Phleps suddenly found themselves citizens of new states rather than subjects of an empire. Phleps had to decide what to do. And he decided to join the Romanian army, not to return to a defeated and humiliated Germany, not to retire from military life, but to continue his career as a professional soldier in the service of the new Romanian state that now controlled Transylvania. He rose in the Romanian army just as he had risen in the Austro-Hungarian army, through competence and hard work and political skill, eventually reaching the rank of general and becoming one of the more senior figures in the Romanian military establishment of the interwar period. He spent 2 decades in this role, learning the geography and the politics and the ethnic dynamics of southeastern Europe in a depth that very few German officers could match. And that matters, because all of that knowledge would later be put to terrible use. But by the late 1930s, something was changing in Arthur Phleps. And that something was ideology, because the rise of National Socialism in Germany and the increasingly aggressive pan-Germanism that accompanied it, was speaking directly to the identity Phleps had built his entire sense of self around. The identity of the ethnic German living in a non-German world, fighting to maintain his culture and his community against the pressure of surrounding peoples. And when Himmler began reaching out to ethnic German communities across Eastern Europe to recruit for his expanding Waffen-SS, the message he was sending was powerful. It said, these communities mattered. It said their German identity was something worth fighting for. It said the SS was building a pan-European German military force that would include and honor the Volksdeutsche, the ethnic Germans of the diaspora. And Phleps heard that message, and it resonated with everything he believed about himself and his people. In 1941, Arthur Phleps did something that must have seemed extraordinary to everyone who knew him. He resigned his commission as a general in the Romanian army. He left behind the career he had spent 20 years building in Bucharest, and at the age of 60, he traveled to Germany to join the Waffen-SS as a volunteer. Think about what that decision means for a moment, because this was not a young man swept up in the excitement of a new movement. This was a 60-year-old general with 40 years of military experience who made a cold and deliberate choice to commit himself to the SS and everything it represented. And that choice tells you something essential about Arthur Phleps. He was not a bystander. He was not a follower. He was not someone who went along with things because it was easier than resisting. He was a true believer, a man who looked at what the SS was and what it stood for and said, yes, this is what I want to be part of. And Himmler recognized immediately what he had in Phleps. A senior officer with combat experience, deep knowledge of the Balkans, the ability to speak multiple languages, including Serbian and Romanian and Hungarian, and an ideological commitment that could be trusted completely. The task that Himmler gave Phleps in 1942 was to create a new SS division from scratch in Yugoslavia. And the raw material he was given was the ethnic German population of the region, the Volksdeutsche, who had lived in Yugoslavia for generations and who were now living under German occupation or in the puppet state of Croatia. Phleps threw himself into this task with everything he had. He traveled across Yugoslavia to recruit. He set up training camps. He established supply chains. He built the organizational structure that would turn a collection of ethnic German farmers and craftsmen into a military force. And he named this division the Prince Eugen Division, after Prince Eugene of Savoy, the great Habsburg commander who had fought the Ottomans in exactly this part of the world 2.5 centuries earlier. And the choice of that name was not accidental. It was a statement of identity and of purpose. It connected the new division to a tradition of German military power in the Balkans that stretched back centuries, and it claimed that tradition as the division's own. That was how Arthur Phleps arrived at the point where his name would become inseparable from terror in Yugoslavia. Not by accident, not by confusion, not by being swept along by history, but by a series of deliberate choices made over decades by a man who had the experience to understand exactly what he was joining and the conviction to embrace it anyway. The Prince Eugen Division became operational in late 1942 and was immediately deployed for anti-partisan warfare in Yugoslavia. But the truth is, what happened next cannot be described in neutral military language. What this division was sent to do was not anti-partisan warfare in any legitimate sense of that term. It was a systematic campaign of terror and murder directed primarily against the civilian population. The theory behind it was explicit. It was stated openly in the orders that came down through the SS command structure. A partisan movement, they argued, could not survive without the support of the civilian population. Therefore, the way to destroy the partisans was to destroy the civilian population that supported them. And in practice, that meant burning villages, executing men of fighting age as suspected partisan sympathizers, driving women and children from their homes in the middle of winter, and making life in areas of partisan activity so unbearable that no one would dare provide any assistance to the resistance. Arthur Phelps implemented this theory with the professional efficiency of a man who had spent 40 years learning his trade. Because he understood that terror works best when it is systematic, when it is predictable, when the population learns that certain behaviors will always produce certain consequences. And the consequence that the Prinz Eugen Division established in the areas where it operated was brutally simple. Any village found to have given any assistance to the partisans, any shelter, any food, any information, would be burned, and its male inhabitants would be shot. That consequence was applied again and again across Serbia and Bosnia and Montenegro and Croatia over the 2 years that the division was in operation. And the cumulative result of that policy was a death toll that historians still struggle to quantify precisely, but that certainly ran into the tens of thousands of civilian lives. One of the first major operations that demonstrated what the Prinz Eugen Division was capable of came in late 1942 and early 1943 in the mountainous region of southeastern Bosnia, where German forces, including the Prinz Eugen Division, were conducting operations against Tito's partisan forces. And the pattern that emerged during these operations became the template for everything that followed. German and SS forces would move into a valley. They would send units ahead to block the exits. Then they would sweep through the villages one by one. The men they found would be interrogated, and those who could not prove they had not assisted the partisans would be shot. The villages themselves would be burned before the troops moved on, and the landscape left behind after one of these operations looked like something from another century. Burned foundations where houses had stood. Bodies in the fields. Survivors, mostly women and children and old people, wandering through a countryside that had been deliberately destroyed. But if those early operations established the pattern, it was Operation Schwarz in May and June of 1943 that revealed what the Prinz Eugen Division could do on a truly massive scale. Operation Schwarz was the largest German anti-partisan operation of the entire Yugoslav campaign. It involved over 100,000 German and Axis troops in a massive coordinated offensive across Bosnia, Montenegro, and Herzegovina, aimed at finally destroying Tito's main partisan force. Phelps was one of the senior SS commanders overseeing the SS component of this operation. And yes, the operation achieved significant military results. It inflicted serious casualties on the partisan forces and drove Tito himself to the brink of defeat. But the methods used to achieve those results went far beyond anything that could be justified by military necessity. What happened in the villages of Montenegro during Operation Schwarz was documented in reports that survived the war and were later introduced as evidence at Nuremberg. And those reports describe a systematic process of collective punishment applied to the civilian population on a scale that was staggering, even by the brutal standards of the Eastern Front. Villages were burned by the hundreds. Men were shot in groups. Mountain communities that had maintained their way of life for centuries were destroyed in a matter of weeks. And the people who survived Operation Schwarz did so not because German forces showed mercy, but because the mountains were large enough that not everyone could be found. The testimony of those survivors, collected by Yugoslav authorities after the war, painted a picture of organized, deliberate mass murder that left no doubt about the nature of what had been done. The numbers from the Prinz Eugen Division's operations are difficult to establish with complete precision because the chaos of war and the deliberate destruction of records make exact accounting impossible. But Yugoslav post-war investigations concluded that the division was directly responsible for the deaths of, at minimum, several tens of thousands of civilians, with some estimates running considerably higher. And these were not deaths that occurred in the course of legitimate military operations against armed combatants. They were the result of a deliberate policy of collective punishment that Phelps had helped design, and that his subordinate commanders implemented with his full knowledge and approval. The villages that were burned, the men who were shot, the families that were destroyed. All of it represented a crime against humanity that was systematic, calculated, and entirely intentional. What is especially important to understand about Phelps's role in all of this is that he was not a commander who lost control of his troops or failed to understand what they were doing. He had 40 years of military experience. He knew exactly what anti-partisan warfare in the Balkans produced when conducted according to SS doctrine. The orders that bore his name and went out to the units of the Prince Eugen Division were not orders that accidentally resulted in civilian deaths as some byproduct of legitimate military action. They were orders that deliberately targeted the civilian population as a primary means of achieving military objectives. And that distinction matters. It matters enormously, because it means that Arthur Phelps was not a commander who merely tolerated atrocities committed by undisciplined troops. He was a commander who ordered atrocities as a matter of deliberate military policy. That makes him not a tragic figure caught up in forces beyond his control, but a war criminal in the fullest sense of that term. The Prince Eugen Division also took part in some of the most notorious specific atrocities of the Yugoslav campaign. One of the most documented was the massacre at Košutica in Serbia in 1943, where the division's troops swept through a cluster of villages in a single operation and executed over 300 civilian men in a single day. The documentation from that massacre includes not only survivor testimony but also German military records that recorded the operation matter-of-factly as a routine anti-partisan clearing action, with the number of executed civilians listed alongside other operational statistics. And really, that cold, bureaucratic language is in some ways more disturbing than any emotional account could ever be, because it shows how completely the murder of civilians had been normalized within the operational culture of the Prince Eugen Division. Then there were the reprisal killings, carried out according to a ratio that the SS command had established and that Phelps's division implemented consistently. The ratio was simple and monstrous. For every German soldier killed by partisans, 100 Yugoslav civilians would be executed in reprisal. For every German soldier wounded, 50 civilians would be executed. These were not informal guidelines. They were not loose suggestions that local commanders applied when they felt like it. They were official policy, backed by orders that went all the way up to the Wehrmacht High Command, and the Prince Eugen Division applied them with mechanical regularity across the territories where it operated. The result was that every partisan attack on German forces could trigger an immediate massacre of whatever civilians happened to be available, regardless of whether those civilians had any connection to the attack. In this way, the German occupation of Yugoslavia created a cycle of violence in which the civilian population paid in blood for every act of resistance, whether they had played any part in it or not. And that is what Arthur Phelps helped build. Not just a military formation, but a system, a machine of terror, efficient, organized, disciplined, and utterly criminal. By 1944, the military situation in Yugoslavia and across the Balkans was changing dramatically as the tide of the war turned against Germany. The Prince Eugen Division found itself fighting not only against Tito's partisans, but against the general collapse of the German position in southeastern Europe. And then the whole structure that Arthur Phelps had operated within for 2 years began to come apart. Romania switched sides in August of 1944. Soviet forces pushed westward through the Balkans. The strategic world Phelps had known started disintegrating around him. And it was in that atmosphere of collapse and chaos that Arthur Phelps met his end. The manner of his death is one of the more dramatic conclusions in the story of any senior SS commander. In September of 1944, Phelps was traveling near Arad in Romania, the same broad region where his story had begun 63 years earlier. and he was captured. But the historical record becomes murky at this point. The exact circumstances of what happened next remain disputed. Different sources give different accounts of whether Phleps was shot while trying to escape or whether he was simply executed after capture. The Soviets and Romanians who took him left no detailed surviving record that fully settles the question. But what is not disputed is this. Arthur Phleps died in September of 1944 on Romanian territory, captured by the forces of the country whose army he had once served, killed in the same borderlands of southeastern Europe where he had spent his career. And really, there is a harsh historical justice in that ending, even if it was not the formal judicial reckoning that his victims deserved. Because the victims of Arthur Phleps never received the full justice they deserved. And that is one of the most troubling parts of his legacy. Yugoslav authorities did prosecute some members of the Prince Eugen division after the war and executed a number of them. But the full accounting for what the division had done was never completed. The reasons were complicated. Cold War politics played a role. So did the difficulty of prosecuting crimes committed by a formation whose members were scattered across multiple countries after the war. But the result was the same. The Prince Eugen Division remained one of the least prosecuted major war crimes formations of the entire Second World War, despite the overwhelming and well-documented evidence of what it did across Yugoslavia between 1942 and 1944. And there is one more dimension to the story of Arthur Phleps that cannot be ignored. It is the question of his legacy among the ethnic German communities he came from. Because in some parts of Romania, and among certain circles that celebrate the history of the Transylvanian Saxons and the Volksdeutsche of Yugoslavia, Arthur Phleps has occasionally been presented as a hero, a man who fought for his people and his culture, a military commander of skill and dedication who deserves to be honored by the communities whose sons he led. But that attempt at rehabilitation is not just historically wrong, it is a moral obscenity. Because the tens of thousands of Yugoslav civilians who died in the operations of the Prince Eugen Division did not die in a war between armed combatants. They died because Arthur Phleps and the commanders who served under him decided that the most efficient way to fight a partisan movement was to murder the civilian population that the partisans lived among. That is the truth. Plain and brutal. No amount of ethnic pride can change it. No appeal to military tradition can soften it. No admiration for discipline or battlefield efficiency can redeem it. What happened under Arthur Phleps was mass murder carried out as a matter of deliberate policy. And that is what makes his story so important. Because the story of Arthur Phleps is ultimately the story of what happens when military competence and professional ambition are placed completely in the service of a criminal ideology. Phleps was not incompetent. He was not reckless in some chaotic, undisciplined sense. He was genuinely capable. He was a real soldier with real skills and real experience. But the terrible truth is that those skills and that experience made him more dangerous, not less. Because an incompetent man given command of the Prince Eugen Division might have produced chaos, but Phleps did not produce chaos. He produced systematic, organized mass murder, efficiently planned and efficiently executed. And that efficiency is his true military legacy. Not the battles he fought, not the divisions he built, not the rank he held, but the villages he burned, the men he had shot, and the families he destroyed across the mountains and valleys of a country that had the misfortune to find itself in the path of everything he had spent his life learning to do. The burned villages of Montenegro and Serbia and Bosnia were rebuilt in the decades after the war. The families that survived had children and grandchildren who grew up first in Yugoslavia and then in the countries that replaced it. The names of the specific villages the Prince Eugen Division burned are not famous names. They are not names that appear in most of the history books people read. But the people who live in those places have not forgotten. They remember, and the mass graves found after the war and the memorial stones placed at the sites of the massacres are the real monument to the career of Arthur Phleps. More honest than any military decoration, more permanent than any reputation built by apologists and admirers. They say more about who he really was than anything else in the historical record. Arthur Phleps was not simply a general. He was not simply an SS officer. He was not simply a man shaped by the violent world of early 20th century Europe. He was a willing architect of terror, a commander who used the full weight of his training, his experience, and his authority to turn doctrine into atrocity and occupation into slaughter. And that is why his name matters. That is why it deserves to be remembered, not with admiration, not with nostalgia, but as a warning. If this story gave you something to think about, leave your thoughts in the comments and support the channel with a like and subscribe.